I've actually tried to make a career out of one real simple idea, in fact, quite an old-fashioned idea, namely that rich folks and large corporations ought to pay their fair share of tax. I don't have to tell you my career hasn't been all that successful. Indeed, it's been a complete failure. Those folks continue to make out like bandits through the tax system. Up to now, maybe. Maybe this book will change things. Indeed, in my efforts to make the rich pay more, one time I was appearing before a finance committee arguing that they should raise the tax on capital gains. Capital gains, which are largely realized by high-income people, get very preferential treatment under the income tax, and I was arguing they shouldn't be getting preferential treatment. And the committee, of course, as they always did, just dismissed me out of hand. And someone came up to me afterwards and asked whether or not I felt like that knight who used to ride around Spain attacking windmills. Ever felt? In fact, I never felt like that, but what I did feel from time to time is like the Black Knight. I don't know how many of you remember the Black Knight. He was the character in the Monty Python movie, Monty Python and the Holy Grail. And in that film, I don't know if you remember that scene, it's a classic scene. In the film King Arthur, anyway, was attempting to get across this tiny little bridge that was being guarded by the Black Knight. So the Black Knight told me he couldn't get across, so King Arthur jumped off his horse, and, well, he jumped in there, and there was a sword fight, and first of all, King Arthur chopped off one of his arms. This is kind of a sick thing, but anyway, chopped off one of his arms, and the knight said, well, it's a mere scratch. And so he chopped off his other arm, and the knight's just a flesh wound, and so he kept trying to bump into him like this. No, he tried to kick him. That was it. So King Arthur cut off one of his legs, and the Black Knight just, come on, let's have that. Started hopping around on his legs, so he chopped his other one off. So then he was hopping around on these stubs of legs, and so oh, that's right. He said, okay, well, maybe we'll call it a draw. He said, let's call it a draw. And so finally, King Arthur just looked at him pathetically and sort of rode off across the bridge, and the Black Knight was shouting after him, come on back. He said, I can still bite. I'll bite your legs off. Anyway, I often feel like the Black Knight. I mean, the rich folks, they just look at you pathetically and disdainful. They don't feel threatened at all, and they probably won't even bother buying this book, the beggars, and they and I'm sure the book won't rise to the level of a minor irritant for them. But anyway, what do you do but keep trying, I guess. Nevertheless, it is the case that I've tried to, my enduring interest in tax law has been the extent to which we can use the tax system to try to finance public institutions like public libraries that enormously enrich everyone's life, no matter how rich or poor you are, and the extent to which we can use the tax system to achieve a more morally acceptable distribution of income than that which results from simply market forces. But here's the 7 premises that underlie the book. Here's the first premise. Here's the first premise of the book. And this is really what motivated the book. We feel that the increasing inequality in income over the past 30 years in Canada, in particular the increasing amount of national income that is being captured by the very, very rich, the top 1%, is the most profound change in our society in our lifetimes. And indeed, that growing gap between the ultra-rich and everyone else will continue, it is now and will continue, to reshape virtually every aspect of our society to the great detriment of ordinary Canadians. It diminishes the well-being of us all, it tears at the fabric of our society, and it corrupts our democracy. And so basically, the rise of this upper rich class is enabling them to rewrite the terms of the social contract that served Canadians and Americans so well in that post-war period in the 40s, 50s, and the 1960s. They're in effect rewriting that contract in a way that in effect means that from now on, the general social institutions will largely favor their interests. So we wrote the book because we're concerned that the kind of society we're becoming, namely a plutocracy in which the rich have a vastly disproportionate influence over public policies and are in effect legislating largely in their own self-interest, and as I say, to the detriment, it seems to us, of ordinary Canadians. So that's really what motivated the book, our concern about this rising ultra-rich class. And basically our argument is that equality matters. And some people say we should only be concerned about inequality at the lower end of the income scale. We should only be concerned about bringing people up out of the poverty level. That's just wrong. A small number of very rich people are as great an obstacle to a flourishing society as a large number of poor people. And we take seriously the well-known words of the famous English social critic, Richard Tawney, who said, "What thoughtful rich people call the problem of poverty, thoughtful poor people with equal justice call the problem of riches." Indeed, it's no coincidence that those countries that have the highest rates of poverty are also those countries with the highest degree of inequality at the high end of the income scale. The second premise is that over the last 30 years, while the percentage of families below the poverty line has remained stubbornly high, the wages of workers have stagnated. The rich have been getting much, much richer at everyone else's expense. And this is the case not only in Canada and the United States, but all Anglo-American countries. And the evidence of inequality at the top end is just everywhere. Most obviously, it's evidenced by the astronomical amounts paid to athletes and entertainers, hedge fund managers, investment specialists, chief executive officers, software entrepreneurs, and top earners in the professions like law and medicine. Most of those markets have become what we call winner-take-all markets, in which small numbers of people are making huge amounts. As I mentioned, the income in Canada of the median family, that is, if you just take the family that earns the amount of income right in the middle of the income distribution of income, so 50% people make more, families make more, 50% less. If you take the median family, the income of the median family in Canada has not gone up in real terms in 30 years. Back in 1975 and $2008, the median family was making about $45,000. That's about what they're making now. It's just stagnated over that whole period of time. But in the meantime, the income of high-income people has simply skyrocketed. In terms of billionaires, for example, from 1999 to 2009, the number of billionaires in Canada has more than doubled, from 25 to 55. Back in the 1960s, CEOs made about 20 times as much as the average worker. Now they make at least 200 times. That means, of course, that the average worker would have to work 200 years just to make the same amount as a CEO makes in 1 year. If someone is only earning minimum wages, they have to work 750 years to make the amount that a CEO makes in 1 year. Indeed, on average, if you just take the 10 top-paid CEOs, they make more than 900 times the average worker, which means someone working the minimum wage would have to work 2,483 years simply to make the same amount as those folks make in 1 year. Over the last 10 years, there's been a bunch of public finance economists in a number of different countries that have been using income tax data, using statistics from income tax. And in Canada, our income tax was passed back in 1917, and so they're collecting all that statistics from people who file tax returns from 1917 on, and are making estimates about what share of the national income is going to the top 1%, of course, or the top 0.1%. And so they've been conducting this over the last 10 years. And you'll see their studies referred to a lot in the book in most of the Anglo-American countries. And what they have found is that over the course of the 20th century in Anglo-American countries, that the degree of income inequality, again we're talking here about at the top end, can be divided into 4 distinct periods. First of all is, and again it's just a central part of our claim, so let me just very briefly, at the turn of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century is what we often refer to as the Gilded Age, where there was this upper class opulence and ostentatious displays of wealth, and everyone spoke of robber barons, and everyone understood the rich were ripping everyone else off. And in Canada, during that period, say in the late 1920s, the top 1% were getting around 15 or 16% of the total income. 15 or 16% of the total income being earned in Canada went to people in the top 1%. And it's important to note that those families could accumulate that vast wealth at the time because there basically wasn't a progressive tax system. And there wasn't any wealth tax that was taxing people when they transferred wealth from one generation to the next. And so they were able to accumulate these vast fortunes. And then the second period is often referred to as the period of the Great Compression. Basically started at the beginning of the 1930s until the end of World War II. And during that period, the share of national income going to the top 1% dropped dramatically. It went from about 15% down to 10%, about 10%. And partly, I mean, because of financial shocks and the war and so on, but also that we introduced really progressive taxes during that period. Indeed, during World War II, the top income tax rate on people earning what would be now over $3.5 million a year was 90%. You know, those are what people like me refer to as the good old days. We had a serious tax system for people earning lots of money, and we introduced a wealth tax, so that when rich people went to transfer their wealth from one generation to the next, the state took 50% of it. Indeed, those rates went up to 70% on wealth over a certain period. So there was this dramatic drop in it. Then, and here's the interesting part, then from 1945 right up until the end of the 1970s, the amount of national income going to the top 1% continued to decline. In the middle of World War II, it was at the end of World War II, it was about 10%. By the end of the 1970s, it was about 70%. Throughout that whole period, we continued to become a more equal society. And let me just make 2 points about that. One point is, there isn't any question, and I think all economic historians agree with this, is that continuing equality was brought about largely by government policies. Among other things, throughout that whole period, the top income tax rate in Canada was 80%. Again, it only applied to very rich people. People are earning over $1 million or so, but 80%, it varied slightly, but around 80% throughout that whole. We had a wealth tax, so that wealthy families who tried to pass all of their wealth from one generation to the next paid a wealth tax. So it was largely government policy that was explaining that increasing equality. Secondly, that during this period, as our society was becoming more equal, I'm sure as you all know, we had our highest rates of economic growth we've ever had, lowest rates of unemployment. That is, there was just broad shared prosperity throughout that whole period. And indeed, in the 1960s, when I went to university and was growing up, the average person's standard of living was doubling every 17 years. Everyone could see they were going to be better off than their parents. And so it was a period of just sort of broad optimism, shared prosperity, and as I say, and basically our society was becoming more equal. Then what happened? I'm sure you're all familiar with this story, is beginning in the 1980s, and this is what we call now the Great Divergence. Beginning in the 1980s, the social contract that had guided Canada throughout that 30 years of shared prosperity began to unravel. And business interests, concerned that they were losing their privileged position in society, literally went on attack. And they just launched a vicious, systematic, and comprehensive attack against the welfare state, and the consequences are, of course, I mean, and began implementing what we widely refer to as the corporate agenda. Economic growth slowed, unemployment increased, but the rich began regaining their privileged position. Indeed, their share of income that they held during the Gilded Age. So by 2007, the top 1% were in effect now receiving over 14% of national income. That is, the amount of national income going to the top 1% literally doubled from 1980 to 2007. And the share going to the really rich, the top 0.01%, tripled over that period. The top 0.01% were getting about 1% of national income in 1980. They were getting almost 3% in 2007. And during that rate, income tax rates, of course, were going down. They went down from 70 to 60 to 50, and now in many provinces somewhere between 40 and 45 is the top rate. And it kicks in at a very low income level. If you're earning $130,000 in most provinces, you're in the top income tax bracket. You pay the same marginal tax rate whether you're earning $130,000 or whether you're earning $1 million. So that our progressive tax system was just decimated. So that's the second premise, anyway, that over the past 30 years, there's been dramatic and unprecedented increase in inequality in the distribution of income and wealth. And no one disputes that. Well, except the people in the Financial Post. In fact, Linda and I got in a little exchange with a couple of the reporters